The Old Man in the Snow, written by E.T. Paone, read by Dylan A. Foster. "You shouldn't be here," Eric said. His voice was pain, dry. The young man closed his eyes, winced through the burn in his throat, and then cleared it. His fingers touched his collarbone at the base of his esophagus. The pain stayed, but he could breathe, at least. There he stood, eyes closed, breathing, listening. Ancient oak planks creaked and groaned, stressed by the pressure of an icy, hollow, baritone wind. He thought it sounded more like an old ship than a cabin. Eric remembered his grandfather, but when he opened his eyes, the old man was no longer there. The young man's attention snapped from the wooden walls, over to the iron stove burning hot, and finally towards the oversized bay window on the other side of the cabin. There, the old man stood, right hand clasping his left wrist behind his back. His grandpa wore white pajama tops and bottoms that Eric thought looked as soft as the snow piling outside. Warmer, too, he hoped. As he studied his elder, Eric frowned at how pale the old man looked, sickly. The glass rattled only inches from Grandpa's face. His rosy nose and open mouth fogged it, but not enough to obscure his view. He'd always liked the view from that spot. In the summer, when nature's blood ran warm, he'd observed a diverse range of animals sprinting, living, eating. And in winter, when things were gentle, he'd watch those same animals shuffle through piles of snow as if lost, looking for any green to eat so that they might soon feel that warmth again. A nasty gust shook the window. He sighed, and his shoulders sank as nothing but puffs of brutal white obscured any actual view. The only thing staring back was his own translucent reflection. "I said you shouldn't be—" "I know what you said," Grandpa cut through his kin's voice. His eyelids, heavy from nearly a century's worth of pain, closed, and he shook his head. He couldn't bring himself to look at his grandson. Not yet. Eric rolled his eyes and lumbered forward a few steps. His fingers found a chess set, which sat on a blue and white checkered cloth on a homemade table. The young man's fingertip ran over the side of an old whittled pawn. It was nearly perfect in every way, except for a diagonal cut across the head. It looked more like a bishop because of that. He chuckled, shaking his head at a memory nearly lost. "I remember making these." His throat was rough. He thought if the problem continued, he'd have to make some tea. Eric ignored the sickness in his throat and the cold coiling around his bones. The pawn in his fingers was a mismatch to the rest only because of the blemish. It was a walnut tree, cut down to size and carved to perfection just outside the door to this cabin that provided the resources for its making, along with the other black pieces. Birch for the white. When Eric was 10, he trotted back to the cabin to escape the summer heat after a day of laborious imaginings. With sweat on his brow and a stick in his hand, he found his grandfather in a rocking chair on the porch. The man seemed old, then. He always moved slowly, concentrated. Between his time-worn fingers in one hand was a piece of wood, and a whittling knife in the other. "Can I help?" young Eric had asked. No was on the tip of his grandfather's tongue, but he could never resist those giant doe eyes. "You ever used a knife before? It's important to move slow. Take your time. You're always in such a rush, but you can't be with this. This could change your life, disfigure it, or worse." Sure enough, but a minute later, the carving knife was on the floor, blood running down its edge and a cut running across the head of the pawn. Eric shrieked, and it was his grandfather who took care of him, stitching the youngster's finger. A piece of wood popped in the furnace, and Eric jumped out of the memory. He stared at the iron stove, then back at the chessboard on the red and white tablecloth. He placed the pawn back onto the board and turned his hand over. There, where the memory had carved its place into his thumb long ago, was a thin thread just a shade darker than the rest of his skin. The scar made him think of pain. The pain made him think of his grandfather. "Grandpa, you—" Eric's throat burned, a dry heat cutting across it. He grabbed a bottle of water and poured some into a pot with more aggravation than intended. He slowed down and placed it on the cast iron stove with a tea bag in it. Clearing his throat again, just enough to speak, he finished his sentence. "You really shouldn't be here." Grandpa looked past his reflection in the window at the blur of Eric behind him. He couldn't make out the man's features, but he could make out the shape of his shaggy hair. "Why are you here, Eric? No one ever comes here." The old man shifted, folding his arms across his chest, and said, "This isn't right. None of this is right." Eric's eyes narrowed. His boots stomped forward. The pot on the furnace hissed, boiling. The wind shook and pressed hard against the walls. "And what do you know about right?" He stopped, studying his grandfather's hair, thin enough to see his scalp, pocked with age marks. He loosened the fists he hadn't realized were at his sides. Eric shook his head as if the fight wasn't worth it, and turned his attention to the pot. When he reached forward, the hot handle singed his palm. Quickly he let go, waving his hand in pain as the metal pot went clanging across the orange glow on the floor. "You never were good with your hands. Got better with a knife, though, didn't you?" Eric pursed his lips and looked towards the bay window. "What's that supposed to—" He couldn't speak. The burn across his throat was too much. He coughed and took a drink of water from the bottle. Even the sip was pain. He needed that tea. Between his throat and the chill running through his bones, he thought for sure he was sick. "And what is that supposed to mean?" Eric asked. His grandfather turned, and tears slid down his leathery face, following the trails of age lines. The aura of invincibility that had veiled Eric's eyes since childhood for the man before him disintegrated. This man, with hard eyes and unshaking stoicism, through the simple act of crying, revealed a compassion that was always there, but Eric never allowed himself to feel. It was the first warmth he'd felt in the cabin. He asked, "What's the matter, Grandpa?" Grandpa's arms unfolded. His shaky fingers moved to his quivering lips. Through them, he said, "Why does it hurt? It shouldn't still hurt." Eric went to speak, but the pain stopped him. His fingers touched the base of his throat, and he stepped closer to the bay window. His grandfather stepped out of the way. Staring back through the reflection was his shaggy hair, doe-brown eyes, long neck, and a fresh cut running horizontally from one side to the other. The hollow wind groaned deeper, but settled. The creaking of the cabin ceased. It was quiet except for Eric's grandfather's weeping and the small hush of the fireplace. Eric thought of the knife in his hands, carving the pawn, and looked back to the table. He couldn't see the chessboard, nor the other side of the cabin. Everything was dark, save for the gentle fireplace, his grandfather, and the bay window. He looked outward. Snow covered every inch of vision, but it settled and fell gently. Everything was white. "I know I shouldn't be here," Grandpa started, "but I needed to say goodbye." Eric cleared his throat again and realized there was no pain. All the pain in the ears, the mental torment, gone, almost as if it was never there. He smiled. "It doesn't hurt, Grandpa." "Are you sure?" The old man's voice trembled. "I'm sure." Eric rubbed his fingers over the wound. The reflection was violent, but his fingers felt nothing but smooth skin. He smiled, eyeing his grandfather's reflection. "I'm sure," he reiterated. Old, rough fingers wiped the tears from an old, rough face. "I know I shouldn't be here," Grandpa said. Eric chuckled. "You shouldn't." "But I didn't want you to be alone," the old man finished. He studied his grandson's beautiful face. He still saw that sweet boy with the baby fat on his cheeks, who would play outside of the cabin. Satisfied, he nodded. "Goodbye, Eric." Eric turned to his grandfather, eye to eye, and smiled one last time. "Goodbye, Grandpa." And then his grandfather turned to go, one step at a time, each an effort. The ancient body moved away from the window, past the fireplace, and through the darkness into nothing, fading. Eric turned toward the open bay window and stepped out into the snow, crossing into the long night. This was The Old Man in the Snow, written by E.T. Paone, read by Dylan A. Foster.